Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
That's right. Welcome to Morning Shot with me, Emaad Akhtar. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI practices, have been deemed by many to be a necessary component of the modern-day workplace. But in recent times, a slew of large global corporations, including the likes of Meta, Amazon, McDonald's, and Boeing, have taken the opposite stance, scaling back on their diversity initiatives. Some companies have justified their decisions citing high costs associated with implementing DEI initiatives or a shift in business strategy. So where do Singapore companies, both SMEs and multinationals, stand on this matter? Well, we hope to find the answer to those questions. We're joined by two guests today. Yuit, President, Association of Small and Medium Enterprises, or ASME. Yuit, good morning.
Morning.
Nice to have you on. And he's also joined by Boon, the Chief Growth Officer for Asia Pacific at Visier, which is a platform that helps companies build, scale, and extend their people analytics practices. Good morning, Boon.
Good morning.
All right, nice to have you both on. Yuit, I'll start with you. In your field, where you cover SMEs, what are you seeing as the current state of DEI in Singapore? Are businesses really walking the talk right now?
Well, when you talk about SMEs and, Singapore businesses, when dealing with small and medium enterprises, primarily what really drives the direction when it comes to manpower policy is really the manpower ministry's policy. And if you look at it right now, mainly it is around fair employment practices and flexible work arrangements. So I think there are some relationship to DEI, but for SMEs in Singapore, primarily, these are the things that come to the top of mind when it comes to manpower policies and implementation, and that's the priorities for us.
Okay. Boon, what would you have to say on this front?
Well, I'd say that what we understand that more than half, some 68% of Singaporean employers actually acknowledge that DEI is a strategic business priority, reflecting a strong shift in mindset from DEI being a compliance-driven initiative to one that supports innovation, employee engagement, and long-term competitiveness.
Okay.
Right, so just this recognition indicates that leaders increasingly see DEI as a driver of organizational performance and a way to attract top talent in a very diverse global market.
All right. Singapore companies, it seems, often straddle Eastern cultural norms as well as Western corporate expectations. So there's a bit of a balancing act here. Yuit, how can leaders strike a balance between cultural sensitivity and progressive DEI agendas?
Well, I think that for every company, especially those in Singapore, we are in the crossroads, right, of the East and West on one hand. But on the other hand, all of our companies have to look at what it means and what matters to the business. And if having a progressive manpower policy above and beyond what compliance and what recommendations there are, it's really around how your company gets advantages, whether you can hire better or whether it results in better employee outcomes and better performance. And I think that's where most SMEs are really focused on. How can I get better results for the company ultimately, and therefore from that benefiting our employees and all the stakeholders?
Yeah. Boon, some have noted that DEI efforts require significant investment for global corporations, including training, recruitment, and organizational restructuring. I'll just throw some stats in here. I mean, these are US-based stats, but according to findings from Harvard Kennedy School, $8 billion is spent on DEI training a year. But many companies remain uncertain of its return on investment for these global corporations. And it results sometimes in companies reallocating resources away from DEI. Do you have any tips on how leaders can make a business case for diversity in their respective organizations?
Sure, happy to share. First of all, I would agree with what you just mentioned. The key thing is to help people understand why do they want to DEI in the first place, right? And linking that to business performance. Now, in that regard, we suggest what leaders can do in building a business case is, one, let's start by establishing what's the existing costs. Like to win buy-in from leadership, start by laying out what a lack of diversity and inclusion is already costing the organization today. Now, we all know that people are our most important assets, and absence of diversity and inclusion puts that resource at risk. So high-performing employees might leave the organization out of frustration with a lack of inclusion, and recruiting new employees will get more difficult. That's point one, establish the existing costs. Point two, underline the potential benefits, linking that again to performance, right? We believe that, and studies have shown that diverse companies have shown to be more profitable, more innovative, and better at decision making. And lastly, decide what to measure. People analytics is that's where it comes in to help diversity and inclusion more measurable. And as the saying goes, what gets measured gets managed. So which diversity and inclusion metrics do you want to measure? For example, compound ratio, which is a ratio of an employee's or group of employees' pay to the pay level midpoint for a given role, is incredibly useful for evaluating how relatively well paid someone is and whether there is a gender or minority-based disparity in the organization. Right? And I would say lastly, start small, right? Start small, improve the benefits and grow along the way.
Okay, fair points, all of them. Yuit, on the flip side, SMEs often have tighter budgets and smaller teams. So what are some realistic DEI practices that smaller businesses can implement without breaking the bank?
You know, for small and medium enterprises, as I mentioned, many of the hiring practices is really around practicality. And in recent times, it's really around workplace fairness. And if you look at the guidelines around that, it is really around hiring for the right quality, right? And in the past, if you look at SMEs and typical hiring, we use proxy indicators in terms of hiring, sometimes results in a lack of diversity. For example, you may ask questions around whether someone plans to have kids and as a proxy indicator about potential performance, right? And all of this is something that the workplace fairness in terms of hiring practices address. And what it does is that it shifts the business mindset from using proxy indicators, which are less accurate, to specific questions where you are asking about things and past experience and things that really make a difference to the performance indicator, performance of the job, of the employee in the job itself. And in that way, right, naturally, by hiring for performance and instead of having these other parameters that are less clear, that brings about greater diversity and inclusion from that perspective. And that's the direction where SMEs are headed towards.
Okay, fair point. Boon, let's get into the weeds or the nuts and bolts of how things are done at Visier. Based on your company's data, what are Singaporean workers, especially Gen Z and millennials, actually expecting from their employers when it comes to inclusion and equality?
So I'll start with a survey done not too long ago, and the survey found that some 44% of Gen Z and 37% of millennials turned down employers or assignments due to misalignment with personal ethics or values, including DEI. Many see DEI as non-negotiable and expect their employers to reflect their views on fairness, representation, and inclusion. And in that regard, the workforce is dominated more and more by the Gen Z and millennials. It's even more important that organizations take into consideration what DEI metrics for an inclusion workplace. Now, we have published some 7 metrics that organizations can look into when they want to deploy DEI. I'll highlight 3: pay equity, hiring, and internal mobility. Right? Let me delve into each of them a little bit more. So pay equity as an equal pay for people who do equal work and have similar experiences. And seniority should be a top priority for DEI. And yet, pay gaps between genders of as much as $30,000 per year exist, according to the recent SHRM survey in Singapore. Now, looking at the compensation practices to spot any gross disparities and not forget to take bonuses and benefits into consideration. Now, in terms of hiring, diversity usually begins with the hiring process, and that's where you need to pay attention to 2 areas: the applicant pool and the subsequent candidate slates, and 2, the hiring panel. You can't control who applies for a position, but you can make sure that your jobs ads are inclusive and don't contain any language that might be perceived as discriminatory. Now, the hiring panel is also very critical. Unconscious bias is a real issue and can seriously slow down the DEI efforts. The more diverse your hiring panel, the more chances they'll reach an unbiased, objective decision. And last point on internal mobility, employees want opportunities to grow, and internal mobility includes both lateral and vertical movements in a company. Now, vertical movements or promotions are a critical number, especially in the context of DEI. So we need to make sure that no group ends up stuck behind the glass ceiling with no prospects of growing in sight. Lateral movement can also be important, and some people outgrow their positions. So the current job may become redundant, but their skills could be valuable elsewhere. Internal mobility is also a good indicator of how inclusive your training programs are. So if one group has no access to such programs while another practices all the time, there's potential discrimination that we need to address.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think there's also a case to be made for, in practice, at the first stage of the process, which is the hiring process, organizations should ensure perhaps that job descriptions avoid exclusionary language and they adopt structured interviews to reduce bias as well. Yuit, coming to you now, here's a criticism that's often been sort of labeled about DEI policies, that they perhaps run the risk of promoting tokenism when not implemented properly. Let me explain. So reverse discrimination, perhaps where minority groups are given certain advantages in employment and education, or if a company considers gender before the skill set of a potential employee. Is that a valid point?
Yeah, I believe it is valid in cases when people do not spend enough time thinking through what fundamentally are the reasons why DEI is there in the first place and how it links to the company and how it links to the enterprise, right? And if you are purely trying to check a box, then that would likely be one of those negative outcomes without really thinking through how it fits into the whole overall company strategy. And typically, in this kind of cases, you see less of that in the SME because they are more aligned with the business and enterprise value and purpose. But that definitely is one of those cases where people are just trying to go through the motion without really understanding the foundations behind that tension.
Yuit, another question I have for you is, do you think there should be a quota system to encourage companies to mandate diversity initiatives, or do you think that can lead to discrimination and negative outcomes in another sense?
Well, if you look at the Singapore landscape, the current hiring landscape, especially for certain businesses, certain industries, is already very challenging. And to add in a quota system on top of that, I think doesn't take into account the situation of lack of manpower and the complexity of work passes and companies having to balance all of that. And really, we wouldn't want to add additional manpower, administrative overheads to companies that in many cases are already dealing with quite a bit of scrambling around getting the right people and finding the right mix of suitable talent to grow the business, especially in the current situation where the global economy is going through a reconfiguration phase.
All right, yeah, perhaps that's something that would be revisited in years to come. Boon, Huat, we've talked a lot about how leaders can make a business case for diversity in organizations, perhaps metrics that can be deployed to measure successful DEI initiatives. But in your experience, what's a common mistake Singapore companies make when rolling out such initiatives, and what would you advise instead?
Sure. I think it's not just Singapore companies, but really globally, a lot of companies set DEI initiatives without putting measurements in place. And at the end of the year, when companies look at efforts and costs that go into DEI and they deem it's unmeasurable, and that's where failures happen. I think it's important that you measure what is meaningful. For DEI work, what organizations look for is data about the way managers versus employees perceive changes in their day-to-day work environment, and they use workforce analytics to identify where you are today. It's a critical input to establishing your future goals and ensuring that they are realistic and achievable. Now, at Visier, we believe that people impact is business impact. You can't manage what you don't measure, so let's use the data to make DEI real, accountable, and impactful for everyone.
All right, the two of you, thank you so much for sharing your insights. We've been talking about DEI practices and where companies stand on these practices here in Singapore. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We were in conversation with Yuit, President of the Association of Small and Medium Enterprises, and Boon, Chief Growth Officer for Asia Pacific at Visier. Stay with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.